So I'm going to talk about three things. The first is to give you some sense for what it's actually like to work in the White House. What do we actually do on a daily basis? And my motivation for doing that is that during the discussion period, my figure of merit is not how many hard questions you ask me, but how many useful ideas you propose, things that I could, my colleagues and I could actually work on after the meeting. So I'm hoping that by providing you a little bit of context, will increase the number of action-oriented recommendations that my colleagues and I can work on after this meeting. The second thing that I want to do is just tell you briefly about some of the things that the administration has accomplished in the area of science, technology, and innovation in the first 4.5 months of the administration. And third, I want to talk about some of the ideas that are still in the nascent stage and don't really represent official administration policy, but are issues that I'm interested in exploring in greater depth with you. So what does a White House staffer actually do? First of all, just to get one issue out of the table, a lot of people ask me, is it like the West Wing? And there are a lot of similarities, the sort of frenetic pace, the fact that you're simultaneously dealing with a domestic, economic, foreign policy, and political crisis all at the same time, that you're continuously trying to balance between what you think is the right thing to do and what is in the public interest, and what you think you can get the votes for. But actually, not all meetings and all discussions occur while people are walking from one room to another. People actually do sit around a table. And the communications director does not get to decide who the Supreme Court justice is going to be. So they've taken a certain amount of liberties, but they do, I think, capture some sense of what it's like to work in. But on any given day, a White House policy person might be working on generating ideas for things that the president might mention in a speech. So Steve Isakowitz and I worked on an initiative that the president announced in the National Academy of Sciences about how we could make clean energy the Sputnik of the Obama generation. We might be working on, once we have that idea, trying to figure out how do we create a consensus both inside and outside the government to move forward with that. We might be involved in an interagency process where there's an issue which by its very nature requires lots of agencies to get involved that may have different views. And there's a sometimes long and painful process that's required to either reach consensus or, if that isn't possible, to frame the issue in a way so that people at the cabinet or even the president can make a decision. A lot of times we're in the mode of having to react to what the Congress is doing. So the Congress is continuously introducing legislation, and some of it actually moves to the floor, and there's a chance that it could become the law of the United States, and we have to make a decision. Is this really bad, and should we threaten to veto it, or is it something that we could live with if they would change the following three things, or how likely is it that this bill will actually pass? And because there are a lot of members of Congress and they're introducing a lot of legislation, that's pretty time intensive. We might be meeting with groups outside the government who everything in the White House is either a sin of omission or commission. It's something the White House is doing that it shouldn't be doing, or it's something that it's not doing that it should be doing. So there are lots of outside groups that are always interested in talking to us about things that they think should be on the president's radar screen. Briefing the press or responding to press inquiries. Creating formal and informal mechanisms for getting advice. Recruiting, not only for our own organizations, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, but for important positions related to science, technology, and innovation across the federal government. So in the same way that a venture capitalist, when evaluating whether or not to invest in a company, might look at does this have the potential to be $1 billion market? Does the firm have a great team? Do they have a basis for sustainable competitive advantage? some of the criteria that I might use when evaluating an idea is it aligned with the president's priorities? That is it going to advance the ball on energy and climate, on education, on healthcare, on creating the long-term foundations for economic growth and job creation? Is there evidence that the policy in question is actually going to work? And that's particularly important if we're talking about scaling something up as opposed to just doing a pilot or an experimentation. What's the level of difficulty versus its impact? Obviously, there are a lot of policy areas like health reform or improving America's schools, which are both incredibly important and very difficult. And this president is clearly willing to challenge those and take those on. But one important issue is, have people been able to identify things that can have a significant impact and are not actually impossible to get done? Has someone developed an implementation strategy that could include everything from an executive order, a presidential decision memorandum, a line item in the president's budget, creating, changing, or eliminating a regulation, taking advantage of the president's bully pulpit and his ability to convene, multi-agency collaboration, or passing legislation? So those are just a few of the tools that we have in the toolkit. So the second topic I wanted to cover is what has the administration actually accomplished relative to science, technology, and innovation in the first 4.5 months. I would say the single largest thing is that these issues were featured prominently in the America's Reinvestment and Recovery Act. So working with Congress, we've been able to invest $20 billion in basic research, the largest increase in our nation's history. $20 billion for health information technology, which will hopefully help reduce administrative costs and reduce medical errors. $7 billion for broadband to stimulate private sector investment in unserved and underserved regions of the country. Major investments in research, development, and demonstration related to clean energy, energy efficiency, and the smart grid that Steve can talk about, and a very large commitment to education. So that's one. The second is that in order to encourage private sector investment, the President has proposed $75 billion to make the research and experimentation tax credit permanent. That will allow companies to count on it and will therefore increase its effectiveness. The third is a proposal to create a large fund for clean energy that would be financed by auctioning off some of the allowances associated with a cap and trade regime. The fourth is to make math and science education a major priority. The fifth is to triple the number of NSF graduate research fellowships. This is a program that has not been increased since its creation in the 50s and 60s. The sixth is proposing a doubling of the budgets of the DOE Office of Science, the National Science Foundation, and NIST. Seventh is to streamline scientific visas. After 9/11, the process of scientists being able to get in and out of the country was so bad that many science and engineering societies announced that they would no longer host their meetings in the United States. So that's something that we're trying to fix. The eighth is to an executive order that the president signed related to increased use of stem cells for regenerative medicine and other applications. The ninth is open government. How do we make government more open, transparent, collaborative, and increase opportunities for participation? And finally, we've been recruiting a lot of great people. Secretary Chu, a Nobel laureate, is our Secretary of Energy. And when you consider that we've had dentists in that position before, that's a pretty big step up. The nation's first Chief Information Officer, Vivek Kundra, the nation's first Chief Technology Officer, Anish Chopra, and also agencies where you might not think about innovation as an important driver. So Alec Ross, who was one of President Obama's campaign advisors on these issues, is a senior advisor to Secretary Clinton. And as a result, she's been talking about what does 21st century diplomacy look like? How does the United States take advantage of social media as a way of being able to interact directly with the people of different countries, such as Muslim majority countries, for example. That's been keeping us reasonably busy, actually, getting all that done. But we have no intention of resting on our laurels. And what I'm going to talk about now are some of the other things that at least I've been thinking about and that are related to the subjects that we've been discussing. One is obviously the subject of this conference, one of the subjects, which is the government's increased use of incentive prizes. As you've heard before, the government has already dipped its toe in this area. Doug Comstock runs a program on this at NASA called Centennial Challenges. Steve has been pushing this at the Department of Energy. You heard yesterday from Tony Tether about the DARPA grand challenges. But when you consider that the government invests a total of $150 billion in research and development, there's a lot more room for experimentation in this area. And so in order to make this happen, we're going to need to, number one, make agencies aware of incentive prizes as a policy mechanism, get them to consider working with people outside. What are some of the biggest impact prizes that they could sponsor? Third is to either have them come to the conclusion that they have the authority to do this or that they could go to the Congress and get it. And finally, put it in the president's budget and persuade Congress to go along with that. So as you can see, there are a number of steps that we have to achieve in order to make incentive prizes a growing part of what the government does to promote innovation in ways that go beyond traditional grants and contracts. But I'm confident that this is an area where we can make progress over the first term of the president's administration. The second issue that I wanted to talk about was what we can do to increase support for high-risk, high-return research. The gallows humor among many people in the research community is that you have to have done the experiment before you can write the grant. And the reason is the sort of insidious combination of proposal pressure and peer review. And what happens when an agency gets 10 or 20 proposals for every one that they can fund, it just takes one person on the panel to say, well, they really haven't demonstrated that they can do that. Missing the point that Einstein made, which is research is what I'm doing, what I don't know what I'm doing. So the government is looking at a number of different mechanisms to try to solve that. One are programs at the National Institutes of Health that bet on individuals, programs like the Innovators Award and the Pioneers Award. And as you'll hear from Steve, we're creating some new organizations like ARPA-E that are all about increasing support for transformational research. The third issue that I wanted to talk about was William Gibson once said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And you could say the same thing about the capacity of different agencies to help create the future. And so if we have a problem that has clear relevance to defense, or even sort of arguable relevance to defense, then we have organizations like DARPA that have a budget of $3 billion that have the ability to really recruit some of the top scientists and engineers as program managers that have special flexibility that allows them to get waivers from the procurement and HR regulations of the government. And then we can really go to town and hopefully advance some important transformational technologies like the internet or GPS or stealth technology, to name just a few. But what if it's an area like education or housing or the future of workforce training? Then our capacity, the government's capacity, is much more limited because the agencies that have that as their mission may have little or no capacity to promote innovation. And so this is one of the things that I believe we need to think about in a more systematic way. And I think a useful thought experiment would be, imagine that an agency which currently has no capacity suddenly grew a DARPA-like arm that was committed to advancing, in the case of the Department of Education, for example. What are the types of things that it might do? So, for example, let's take a problem like early reading. If you look at the number of age-appropriate books per household in Beverly Hills, it's 199. Does anyone know what it is in watts? 0.04. So one question is not that technology can solve all these problems associated with deep social inequality, but could we use combined advances in cognitive science, intelligent tutoring systems, low-cost consumer electronics, and human-computer interaction to develop a low-cost educational toy that would approach the effectiveness of a one-on-one tutor for reading. So that's the type of thing where if a broader range of agencies, and maybe Peter will tell me that we can just do this through a prize, and that's certainly a possibility. But if you had more agencies who are responsible for critical national problems having an increased ability to support innovation, I think that would be a good thing, and it would allow us to tackle some of the problems we've been dealing with in a broader way. I'm now over time, so I'm going to close with one last thought, heeding the adage, anything you can do, I can do meta. So I'm going to talk about meta ideas and give you a quote from Paul Romer, economist at Stanford, who's been thinking about these. And he says something that I think is important, which is perhaps the most important ideas of all are meta ideas. These are ideas about how to support the production and transmission of other ideas. And he mentions as examples Britain inventing patent and copyright in the 17th century, the US with its agricultural extension service, or peer-reviewed basic research in the 20th century. And he goes on to say, only a failure of imagination, the same one that leads the man on the street to suppose that everything has already been invented, leads us to believe that all the relevant institutions have been designed and that all the policy levers have been found. So the other question I'm interested in is how can we have a more explicit national and even international conversation about what the most compelling meta ideas of the 21st century are. Thank you very much. So I'm delighted to take any questions you have. As I said before, I'm even more interested in getting your concrete recommendations about what the administration might do in the area of science, technology, and innovation. Yes.
First, thank you for your public service, and thanks for coming today.
Sure.
How are the two administrations different, and do you deal differently with Senate versus the House?
Well, so are you asking me to compare the Bush administration to the Obama administration or the Clinton administration to
your experience, yes.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I would say that probably the biggest difference is the circumstances under which we find ourselves. So particularly in the second term of the Clinton administration, we had a situation where unemployment was down to 4%, that we had double-digit growth in capital investment, that not only had we eliminated the deficit, but we were on a track to pay down the national debt. And that was good news. But it also meant that people were pretty happy with the combination of peace and prosperity. And so in an environment like that, there's limited political space for really dramatic changes in public policy because everything is working okay. And so I think that the economic and financial crisis, the fact that we're struggling with healthcare costs, any number of other challenges, has created space for consideration of more, dramatic policy changes. So I think I would say that is probably the biggest difference between the two administrations. Peter.
Tom, there appears to me to be a natural conflict between government using incentive prizes, which is Congress critters want to be able to direct money towards a particular congressional district, and a prize basically is independent of that.
Right.
What's your assessment of that conflict, and what is the most you'd ever see incentive prizes coming out of the government? Will you see $100 million or $1 billion prizes ever?
Well, I don't think we'll get there all at once. So I think that we will have to have some successes with smaller prizes and then build up to doing something more ambitious than that. But I think the existence proof is that the Congress supports a budget of $30 billion for the National Institutes of Health, and that money is not earmarked. It's allocated on a competitive peer review basis. So it is true that members of Congress like money with a zip code, but they have a demonstrated willingness to support money that is competitively allocated.
Thomas, we met briefly last night, and I'd mentioned to you that the Scottish Government is the first government ever to create a competition. Do you see in the future that the US government would work in partnership with other governments to come up with either support current competitions or come up with new competitions?
Absolutely. So one area that is related to incentive prizes that we now have 5 governments plus the Gates Foundation putting $1.5 billion into is something called an advanced market commitment. So it is a purchase order for a product which does not exist. So it has some of the elements of a prize, although it's different in some respects. And that's to accelerate development of a pneumococcal vaccine. And as I said, 5 governments, including Russia, Norway, Italy, UK, I think Canada is involved as well, are all supporting that. And assuming this one goes well, people are talking about this doing this for malaria and tuberculosis as well. So for really big prizes, this type of international cooperation makes a lot of sense. Alex.
You mentioned before that you were talking about how to make clean energy the Sputnik of the Obama administration. How can you do that? And are there any countries that you admire that are doing it right?
I'm going to let Steve talk about that in the panel.
How about other countries for science policy? Any that you admire?
Well, there are certainly a lot of countries that I think we have the ability to learn from. So there are a number of the Scandinavian countries who have the notion of design much more firmly as elements of science and technology policy. So that I think is something that we could definitely learn from.
I have a dream, okay, and I'm gonna just dump random suggestions on you since you asked. Okay,
right.
Please forgive me if you know them already. I think it would be very beneficial for the president to have what I would call a discussion or a conversation on innovation hosted by each federal agency, geographically distributed around the country, private, public, nonprofit, profit, university, STEM, etc.
Yep.
Day-long event. He can open them up regionally, and then we can begin to start the dialogue and have immersive interactive tools to support it to carry on the conversation. I could see energy discovery institutes located strategically around the country in partnership with DOE, NASA, NIST, and perhaps DARPA. And they could again be the private-public collaborative STEM community involvement kind of institute. I can see internal prizes, innovation prizes for each federal agency. I can see a strategic needs assessment with regard to innovation and technology done by OSTP with the input of the federal agencies. Once we have a strategic roadmap, then I can see new mechanisms being tried to address those needs, like the model that AFRL uses in its collaboratory, which you could morph and call a collaboratorium, and it could be populated among and between several federal agencies. So there are all kinds of vehicles to do all kinds of really radical, innovative things, provided that you know where you're going.
So I think a step towards what you're talking about, we now have a process going on that's led by Beth Novak, who's our Director of Open Government at OSTP. And if you go to www.whitehouse.gov/open, you'll see an online brainstorming session that's going on about how to move the president's open government agenda forward.
We'll take one more question.
Okay. Douglas?
I have just one comment and one quick question. From a comment standpoint, and it impacts both your area of government as well as lots of others, and that has to do with tax policy. You know, for us to get out of the mess we're in, it's going to come down to growth, and growth has always come from entrepreneurs and from small business. As we talk about tax policy, if I invest in a share of IBM, or I invest the same amount of money in a startup of a company that creates jobs, and I hold them each for a year and 1 day, I pay the exact same taxes on that. You know, as you think about raising capital gains and all that, taking into account risk capital that creates jobs versus just an investment, I think is important. Second part, which is really the question, you know, as an entrepreneur my whole life, and I've built large companies, I've built small companies, it's so hard to comprehend and to find ways to actually tap into the vast resources of government, especially during the early years, because you just don't have the resources. You're focused on the business.
Right.
And so thinking about how you can actually get both cross-collaboration amongst agencies as well as to make it easier to actually impact in a positive way the entrepreneurial community, I think is important, because it's not working today.
Right. So one of the things that we're doing is something called data.gov, in which the government will be making large numbers of machine-readable data sets available. And our hope is, Don Tapscott talked about this yesterday, the notion of government as a platform, that people will be building applications on top of this to make the issues that you raised about information discovery and retrieval and search and UI something that there will be a lot of private sector innovation that builds on the basic data that the government has at its disposal. Thank you all very much.